Welcome back everyone to Bridge the Divide, where we examine irrational beliefs, the irrational behaviors that often follow, and how with education, rationality, and reason we can bridge the societal divides that they create. Today, we're going to take a look at a collection of short vids in which a variety of theists make a variety of claims. So seeing as how there's a lot for us to get to, let's not waste any time and dive right in. This first clip comes from the channel Bible Revealed, or if you go by the channel's banner, it could be Bible Relieved.
Quite impressed, really.
But that's the kind of thing that happens when you rely solely upon AI to make a channel. Let's see what they have to say.
Believe the amazing things science has uncovered that prove the Bible is true. So let's race through 9 incredible discoveries with real evidence.
Now obviously we can't discount the fact that there are people, places, and events mentioned within the text of the Bible that interdisciplinary scientific analysis has confirmed to have existed and have happened. And there's no real issue with this because we see the exact same thing in cultural and religious texts from all around the world. But making the historical claim that ancient people recorded their interpretations of the beliefs and behaviors of other people, events they heard about or witnessed, and places they visited or heard about is pretty mundane, and claiming that because the book contains some truth, then all the other claims in the book are necessarily true is just a fallacy of composition, because any probabilistic truth to the historic claims in the text says nothing as to the possible truth of the theological or supernatural claims.
A worldwide flood. Marine fossils have been found on mountaintops all over the world, proving that water once covered the earth.
It's a made-up tale. It's a total fabrication. It never happened. It never happened. This one was invented by a writer.
So first, there was no global flood. Had there been one, there would be extremely obvious evidence of it, and there simply isn't. Not to mention things like the heat problem that have been articulated by individuals such as Erica over at the channel Gutsick Gibbon. This is precisely why creationist apologists have consistently needed to concede that they have to appeal to magic and mystery in order to justify holding that the event ever took place. And marine fossils on top of mountains? Those don't confirm that the entire planet itself was once underwater. They do, however, confirm that that specific land was itself once underwater. And plate tectonics explains how mountain ranges develop through an extreme form of uplift called orogeny that occurs at convergent plate boundaries, which results in areas of seafloor that are already chock full of ancient fossils being pushed upwards to form these ranges. The Himalayas, where the Indian and Eurasian plates collided, are a perfect example of this. Not to mention the youngest fossils ever found on a mountain so far date back to 28 million years ago, while the oldest fossils ever found date back 2 billion years. Age ranges, by the way, that directly contradict the biblical flood narrative, as that event was supposed to have taken place in between 10 and 6,000 years ago. So this evidence presented here does not confirm the Noachian flood myth, a myth, by the way, that itself was almost completely plagiarized from the Mesopotamian epic of Gilgamesh, because the evidence is just too busy confirming plate tectonic theory.
The walls of Jericho collapsed outward just as Joshua described in the book of Joshua.
I've already covered this one in a previous video, so this one's going to be pretty easy. Yes, archaeology has confirmed that the walls of Jericho fell outward, but the field of archaeology, working hand in hand with the fields of geology, anthropology, and chemistry, confirm not only that those walls collapsed outward nearly a century before the purported date of the siege, but also that it was most likely an earthquake that caused their collapse, and the walls fell outward specifically because of how they were constructed.
The cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed by a cosmic blast, leaving behind scorched earth and ruins.
So this one is a little bit more difficult to nail down. Firstly, no one knows exactly where the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah were actually located, or even if they actually existed as depicted in the Bible. However, their locations are traditionally held to have been somewhere along the Dead Sea, similar to the city of Jericho, which sits right smack in the middle of the Jordan Rift Valley. Secondly, while there are excavated early Bronze Age habitations that some religious groups have traditionally attributed to being Sodom and Gomorrah, there is a tremendous amount of debate and zero consensus regarding the accuracy of these claims. What we do know is that there were excavated habitations in the Jordan Rift Valley that contained evidence of having been exposed to destructive conflagration. And given how notorious the Jordan Rift Valley is for how tectonically unstable it is, being located on the Dead Sea Transform Fault System, which enjoys a jaunty slip rate of around 5 millimeters per year, the consensus in light of the evidence is that these cities that are traditionally held to be Sodom and Gomorrah were ultimately destroyed by an earthquake. And And by the way, I know that 5 millimeters per year doesn't seem like much, but in geological terms it is significant. The sheer size and slip rate of the Dead Sea transform is beaten out by only 4 other fault systems around the planet. The East African rifts average 6 millimeters per year, the North Anatolian faults 20 millimeters per year, the Alpine faults 27 to 30 millimeters per year, and the legendary San Andreas fault, which screams along at an average of 36 millimeters per year. So while the land, water, and climate in what is historically regarded to be the Fertile Crescent was ripe with resources and excellent for agriculture, its seismic instability probably ranks it up there with Pompeii as one of the worst places to set up shop. And I think it's fairly reasonable to conclude that the prevalence of powerful destructive earthquakes in that area is a fantastic indicator as to why exactly the ancient Hebrews viewed the character of their god the way they did.
Inscriptions of the House of David have been found carved in stone, proving the existence of King David.
The existence of King David is one of those claims that's irrelevant in regards to the theological and supernatural claims in the book. That a guy lived and believed some things, or there were people that existed that believed things about him, does not indicate in any way that those things were actually true.
Clay tablets from the Babylonian exile have been discovered that match the account in the Book of Kings.
Yes, the siege of Jerusalem, the deposition of King Jehoiakim, the appointment of Zedekiah, and the removal of treasure from the temple have all been confirmed by multiple lines of evidence. But again, the historical truths surrounding the exile do not logically entail that a god exists or that Jesus was supernatural in nature, which are necessarily the bare minimum requirements for Christianity to be true.
The darkness of the crucifixion wasn't just a biblical account. Roman historians recorded it as well.
Firstly, we have to point out that a solar eclipse at the time of the Passover would be impossible because a full moon can never block the sun. That's just orbital mechanics. Secondly, solar eclipses last on average only a few minutes, so the biblical account of a 3-hour darkness would automatically discount a solar eclipse entirely. Now recently, there have been some claims that there was a partial lunar eclipse that occurred on April 3rd, 33 CE, which might line up with the account of darkness in the Bible at the time of the crucifixion, and I say might because as of yet there has been no specific actual date confirmed for that particular event. Still, this isn't evidence that a god exists or that Jesus was supernatural in nature, but I do certainly understand how the deeply superstitious members of a cult could interpret the occurrence of an eclipse as being more significant than it was.
The Tower of Babel was a real place. Ancient ziggurats reached for the sky, just like the biblical account.
The scholarly consensus here is that the Tower of Babel did not exist as a single structure, and the idea was most likely inspired by the massive multi-tiered ziggurats of the Mesopotamian Empire, particularly the Etemenenki ziggurat in Babylon. Overall, the story of the Tower of Babel is widely considered to be an Israelite myth that was invented to explain observed human diversity.
The Pool of Bethesda, mentioned in John chapter 5, has been discovered under modern-day Jerusalem.
True, an excavation carried out by German archaeologist Konrad Schick in Jerusalem near St. Anne's Church in 1888 discovered the remains of the Pool of Bethesda. But that the existence of a man-made pool in Jerusalem was confirmed by archaeologists does not a god claim justify.
The Red Sea crossing. A satellite image revealed an underwater land bridge that allowed Moses to lead his people out of Egypt.
And this one is just a straight up lie. I can, however, tell you from where this lie originated. This particular claim comes from Glenn Fritz, a biblical researcher who focuses primarily on the geography of the Exodus. He claimed that by using satellite imagery and environmental geography, he was able to confirm that the biblical Sea of Reeds is what is now known as the Gulf of Aqaba, and that the crossing point of the Exodus was at what is now known as Nuweiba Beach over what was originally a natural land bridge. However, none of his claims have been verified, none of his work has been submitted for peer review, and he's been largely rejected by the whole of scholarship, both biblical and scientific. But honestly, none of that should actually surprise you, because it is the exact outcome that we would expect concerning a guy who literally claimed that he was following in the footsteps of the guy who originally made the Nuweiba Beach claim back in the 70s. And that guy was the notorious religious con man and grifter Ron Wyatt.
Oh, Johnny, did you back the wrong horse?
This next video comes to us courtesy of the channel Opinion Overdrive, and it features a particularly controversial public figure trying to prove that the god he claimed exists, at least you know up until September 10th that is, actually exists as a concrete thing in reality.
Charlie Kirk proved exactly why God is real. Because when this conservative asked why evil exists, his brutal truth destroyed every atheist claim instantly.
So right off the bat, we can already tell that this question is aimed at exactly how Kirk reconciles the Epicurean trilemma, otherwise known as the problem of evil. And by the way the question was worded, we know that it's the logical problem of evil, which identifies the logical contradiction that is entailed by the simultaneous existence of evil and the triomni God, as opposed to the evidential problem of evil, which merely addresses the reduced probability that an omni-God exists given the amount of gratuitous, unnecessary suffering that empirically exists in the world.
I'm lucky to have found the love of my life. However, she's not where I am in my journey with Christ, and I want to have a marriage centered around Christ, and I want to know what are some of the best ways I can help guide her towards our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ so that we can share a happy future together.
And now we have the context of the question, which is how this guy can change the worldview of another person, the person in question being the love of his life, because he has been conditioned to predicate the happiness in his life upon being a member of his faith and believing what he believes. And yes, this question is a giant red flag, because it ultimately devalues the other individual and their personal experiences through the implication of this guy's belief that the only way true happiness can be attained within that relationship is if the quote-unquote love of his life fundamentally changes their worldview, specifically by abandoning any prior commitments they may have to their critical faculties, so that their worldview will then match what he believes it ought to be.
Run, big run for your life, get some help!
Also, I'm not entirely sure what exactly this has to do with the problem of evil, unless of course the problem of evil is the reason why the individual in this guy's life disagrees with his position on the God proposition. But let's see what the Chuckster here said.
Phenomenal question. What is her objection as to why she will not follow Jesus?
She doesn't really know how there can be a higher power when there's so much evil in the world.
Okay, so it's the woman in question who is invoking the logical problem of evil, and as far as internal critiques of the Christian worldview go, that's probably one of the best places to start.
So here's what you should say. Evil cannot exist if there is no standard of good. She only knows something is evil because she believes there's a transcendent good. Evil is just an opinion if there is no God.
I first have to say, for someone as wildly philosophically bankrupt as Kirk was, he certainly had a way of coming off as being knowledgeable. At least, to anyone with a below room temperature IQ. However, anyone with even a modicum of education within this field will instantly recognize that despite all of the rhetoric, Kirk never actually answered the question. And it's likely because he knows that the logical problem of evil cannot be reconciled when it's approached with any degree of intellectual honesty. The first thing he did in response to the question was to invoke the concept of coherency or logical consistency.
Evil cannot exist if there is no standard of good.
As an abstract concept, for the term evil to be coherent, meaning in order for us to understand exactly what we mean when we label a thing as being evil, we must necessarily have an abstract concept that refers to those things that the term evil is not being applied to. And typically, these are things that we label as being good. But all these abstract concepts are doing are identifying those things that human beings have subjectively classified as being preferred or not preferred within varying contexts. And then Kirk goes on to assert that the person in question believes in transcendent good.
She only knows something is evil because she believes there's a transcendent good.
Which is just a phenomenally manipulative statement. Firstly, because Christian nationalist Jack Sparrow here never claimed that the woman in question was herself a moral realist, so Kirk is not justified in making that assertion, which tells us that he ultimately made that assertion because he himself knows that the guy asking the question is himself a moral realist, and Kirk knew that making that assertion would affirm that this guy asking the question about the love of his life was right, which validates him and thus emotionally endears him to Kirk. Essentially, instead of answering the question, he just told the guy that he was right, and having emotionally validated the guy, that makes it easier for Kirk to slip away with a non-answer because the guy already feels good for just having asked the question. Secondly, Kirk uses the term transcendent here in place of objective or mind stance independent. He shrewdly does this because 1, the term automatically invokes God fifis as the God concept itself is described as being transcendent, which allows him to play directly to his audience's expectations and strengthens his illusion of authority as a speaker on behalf of Christianity, and 2, he uses it because he himself holds to moral realism despite being a Christian, which demonstrates that he's either outright lying or he's just deeply philosophically ignorant. And 3, he uses it because it affords him the opportunity to avoid getting dragged into a larger philosophical conversation by keeping the subject firmly focused in theology. And the third major point here is that Kirk is being intellectually dishonest in his representation of what moral anti-realism is.
Evil is just an opinion if there is no God.
Criticizing it heavily for its position being that moral statements are mind-stance dependent, while simultaneously ignoring the Euthyphro dilemma, which, if Kirk's God in question is in fact defined as being ultimate, actually confirms moral anti-realism, as definitionally nothing exists external of the God to provide coherency or mental content for why the God ought to label something as good or evil beyond its own individual stances. And just to address this, because I know it's going to come up in the comments, the oft-used response that the God labels a thing as being good because that thing aligns with its nature is nothing more than an uninformative tautology used to dodge the dilemma.
Murder is not wrong if there is no God. Stealing is not wrong if there is no God. We as Christians, we have to explain a couple things. We have to explain, like, child suffering. Like, I'll be honest, it's really tough for us to wrestle with the fact that these girls are at Christian summer camp and they get washed away in a flood. It's tough. Right? We have to explain child cancer and flooding and earthquakes. But the atheist, they have to explain everything else.
And at this point, Kirk is just lying his ass off, likely so he can continue playing to the expectations of his audience. It's just an insubstantial performance. Moral anti-realism does not entail that murder is not wrong. The statement Charlie made there is just profoundly stupid, but his emotionally charged audience either doesn't know that or simply lacks the capacity to recognize it in that moment. The socially established legal term murder refers specifically to the act of taking another person's life, the action of homicide, without justification. So in the societal context, we understand the act of murder being wrong or unlawful as being analytically true. The problem that arises, however, is that determining if the act of homicide itself qualifies as being murder or not is entirely dependent upon the societally agreed upon standards for that which constitutes justification. Standards, by the way, that are entirely mind stance dependent. The stance in this context being the goals that the collective society have agreed upon. And all of this equally applies to the act of physically taking something from somebody else. If it's unjustified, we call it stealing. But if it's justified, we call it recovery or reclamation. But then Charlie goes on to add the qualifier, if there is no God.
Murder is not wrong if there is no God. Stealing is not wrong if there is no God.
Which of course affirms his position that if a God exists, then moral realism, the position that moral statements are mind stance independent, is true, which of course is a position that is outright refuted by the aforementioned Euthyphro dilemma. But then, and you likely noticed this,
we as Christians, we have to explain a couple things. We have to explain, like, child suffering.
Charlie deceptively switched gears from the logical problem of evil to the evidential problem of evil when he cited the Guadalupe River flash flood incident at Camp Mystic, a girls' Christian summer camp in Kerr County, Texas that took the lives of 27 campers and counselors.
Like, I'll be honest, it's really tough for us to wrestle with the fact that these girls are at Christian summer camp and they get washed away in a flood. It's tough. Right?
At this point, he's no longer talking about logical possibility, which was the original issue that this guy brought to the table, because he's now talking probability. And it's in this small moment that I will now invite you to contemplate just what kind of a person would feel justified in invoking the tragic deaths of 27 people just so they wouldn't have to answer a question. So in the end, Kirk doesn't address how he reconciles the issue. He dodges the broader philosophical discussion in order to pander to his audience's emotions. He switches subjects in order to avoid dealing with the more difficult topic on the table, and then he weirdly tries to denigrate atheists by implying that the position logically entails holding to some other specific scientific or philosophical positions, which is just another outright lie. So no, this clip did not show Charlie Kirk proving that there is in fact a God. It did, however, provide a fantastic example of just how wantonly dishonest, philosophically bankrupt, and emotionally manipulative of a rhetorician he was. But hey, anything to keep those doubloons rolling in, am I right, Erica? This next one comes to us from the channel Fisher of Men, where Beach Bum Jesus here tries to use science to prove the existence of his God.
Watch as believer uses the laws of science to prove the existence of God.
Everything that is proves God.
Well, we know that you believe that because you've been convinced of it. The question is, can you actually explain how you determine that beyond just an argument from personal incredulity?
And when you do use science, right? What science will tell you is that everything ultimately leads to some intelligent creator.
Why must you turn my office into a house of lies?
There is nothing in any scientific field that leads to the conclusion that an intelligent creator or a God entity exists.
The deepest, furthest out scientists that you can find today definitively speak to this.
The quote-unquote deepest, furthest out likely being those individuals who have been largely rejected by scientific community and academia for constantly spouting long-debunked pseudoscientific concepts.
Right? So it's all chaos. Well, listen, you were sitting here right now. My eyes still stick in my head. This is not chaos.
No one is saying it's chaos, but no one is saying it's intentional either. A lack of overarching intention does not imply chaos. It just means that things exist the way they do because they are the result of the prior circumstances that facilitated that outcome. So ultimately, this was never about science. It was just an argument from personal incredulity with an implication of begging the question. This next one comes from the channel As-Salam, and it features the host being asked directly by his guest what exactly is the evidence he has for his God.
What is then the evidence for God? What is the proof that it doesn't work for any of the other religions?
My best evidence for the existence of God is I don't need to prove the existence of God.
Wait, what?
Because it's a part of human nature innately with us.
So this is just flatly incorrect. Human reasoning is unfortunately prone to things that we call type 1 errors, or errors of commission, and type 2 errors, or errors of omission. What this means is that we have a tendency to either reject the status quo in favor of new, misleading information, or we tend to accept a misleading status quo due to failing to or outright refusing to recognize why it is misleading. Usually these errors are committed due to things like personal prejudices and confirmation bias. Now, in the ancient history of our species, these errors functioned as a remarkable survival mechanism, enabling us to avoid dangers that we didn't readily detect and maintain social cohesion through the establishing of common beliefs and cultures. And while our capacity to make these errors still serves that evolutionary function, today they often cause more problems than they solve. Now, the kicker here is that God concepts themselves are foundationally conclusions, not starting points. Throughout human history, these concepts have been primarily invoked in order to explain natural phenomena that humans didn't readily understand, or they're created out of whole cloth to directly represent the various abstract concepts we invent to describe, categorize, and quantify the reality that we perceive. And a huge part of that is ascribing meaning and value to the various patterns that we may recognize in nature. Those would be the type 1 errors that I mentioned earlier. The empirical evidence shows us that it is not the innate knowledge or understanding of God concepts that humans are born with. What it does show us is that humans, just like virtually all other animals on this planet, are born with the innate survival-driven impulse to establish control over their environment. And that includes eliminating by any means necessary the unknown, which is often accomplished by assigning meaning and value to the experienced external and internal phenomena that often trigger intense emotional reactions such as joy and love, but also anger, anxiety, and fear. Living in a constant state of anxiety is not only detrimental to individual health, but it is also detrimental to community cohesion and survival. So, by eliminating sources of existential dread by any means necessary, rational or irrational, we enable ourselves and by extension our communities to live more contentedly and more healthfully.
There are multiple studies that show that, like Justin Barrett's study. A bunch of atheists who conducted a study in Oxford University came to the conclusion.
So this is a terrible example because that's not actually what Barrett's work confirmed. Justin Barrett, who is himself a Christian experimental psychologist, wrote his thesis, Born Believers. And in that, he talks about how it appears to be the case that human beings are born with cognitive faculties that naturally produce belief in God concepts. But if you remove the obvious bias in that statement, the observation should be that human beings appear to be born with cognitive faculties that make them highly susceptible to accepting these things, such as God concepts, as being true, especially when the individuals in question are children who have already been primed with that information by their parents and their peers, individuals that they often initially trust implicitly. But the propensity for human beings to be convinced of psychologically and emotionally satisfying yet wholly irrational concepts, such as the existence of God entities, does not logically entail that such an entity or entities actually exist in reality. Parsimoniously, it just indicates that our species is highly prone to accept accepting pretty lies over harsh truths. And while the ready acceptance of God concepts does seem to be the case for many people on Earth, we also know that the development of God concepts is not a universal phenomenon, as is indicated by the existence of civilizations on this planet that possess no independently developed God concepts in their cultures, which would be empirical evidence that directly refutes Barrett's observation. It must also be mentioned that Barrett's methodology in these experiments was extraordinarily flawed, primarily because he ignores the fact that his subjects were already behaviorally conditioned by their parents for specific behaviors and responses, but also because of how he bases his interpretations of the data from his experiments upon the various unjustified metaphysical assumptions he makes in virtue of his personal belief system. I mean, come on, Barrett. Children recognize that moral facts are objective? Are you kidding me? Children believe that it is wrong to hurt other people, often in spite of their personal impulses, because their parents, as members of this society, have conditioned them to believe that. Children don't innately understand the distinction between mind stance dependence and independence, Justin. Typically, they'll believe whatever the hell they're told by someone they view as an authority until they are given a reason not to trust that individual. That's not evidence that kids are tapped into some kind of objective truth. It's just evidence that blind trust comes more readily to children because, well, they're freaking children. They're ignorant. They're naive. They haven't yet been conditioned through years of social experience to recognize the behavioral cues that indicate when someone is not to be trusted. Barrett also flatly ignores the mountains of data that supports the conclusion that accepting specific God concepts is largely informed by geographic bias. Seriously, he takes all the data regarding geographic bias, behavioral conditioning, and cultural indoctrination and just throws it out the window. Suffice to say, his personal bias ruins any opportunity he might have had to do any actual relevant science.
Dr. Oliver Petrovich, he did the same thing on Japanese children.
Petrovich's work also confirmed the same thing that Barrett's did, that these concepts are not innate to humans, but the errors in reasoning that we too often make that can result in us irrationally accepting such propositions as being true are extremely common for our species.
You can look at certain tribes that were separated from the rest of the world. They still believed every civilization, literally, in human history, had a belief of a higher entity.
That's also a lie. There are cultures that still exist today that never independently developed a God concept, and the only reason they possess the awareness of God concepts now is because they were introduced to them by the people that discovered them.
Children are born, even in societies which are atheistic, and I'm giving studies and references. You just
I understand. I agree with you.
They innately believe in a creator. So,
by the way, the host here pulled this directly from Barrett's work, and we know it's not true because of the extremely obvious personal bias that Barrett allowed to inform his conclusions.
So why do I need to prove something which is innately a part of my human nature?
Well, you may be convinced now that it's innate, but you'd be flatly wrong on that. But even if it were innate to you, we know from the evidence that it is not innate to everyone on the planet. So you would still need to explain how something is innately true for you as a human being, but is not innately true for every other human being on the planet. And until you're able to do something like that, all you're doing here is utilizing bad science in order to dodge the challenge to your epistemology.
My best evidence for the existence of God is I don't need to prove the existence of God.
And you're likely doing it because you know that the break in your epistemology has been exposed and you have no rational way to defend it. In this next vid from apologist Ken Coughlin's channel, he's chosen to clout chase Matt Dillahunty by addressing Matt's position regarding what evidence would convince him of the existence of a god.
I have no idea specifically what would change my mind about the existence of a god. But if there is such a being as a god, then one would think that God knows exactly what would change my mind and should be capable of taking the action to present the case that would change my mind. And this hasn't happened, which means that either this God does not exist or this God doesn't want me to know that he exists yet. Either way, it's not my problem.
So we have Matt here articulating his position regarding evidence. While he personally is not currently aware of any evidence that would convince him a god exists, if such an entity did exist, it ostensibly would know the evidence that would convince Matt, and thus far it has either been unwilling or unable to provide that evidence to him. So either the god that is being presented to Matt has been defined incorrectly, or it doesn't exist at all. And notice that Matt did not say that nothing at all would ever convince him, and he's not saying that convincing him that a god exists is in any any way impossible. What this tells us is that Matt is being intellectually honest in his internal critique of the God that he's being presented with. Given this, there is definitely one question for Ken here. Why are you lying in the title of your video?
Or is it possible that God does know what would change your mind, and the answer is nothing?
No, that would be you misrepresenting Matt's position. Matt is openly acknowledging that it is well within the realm of logical possibility that he could be convinced that a God exists. And he openly acknowledges that if such an entity did in fact exist, then it definitionally would know what specific evidence would convince Matt of its existence. That's being intellectually honest. You, however, Ken, have chosen to open your response by directly implying that Matt is lying, which is not just uncharitable, but it is also intellectually dishonest, just like you were when you titled your video.
Maybe you are so determined not to believe that no amount of evidence would convince you.
That maybe is doing a shit ton of heavy lifting, but you've put yourself in a position where you have to invoke that because, despite your inability to confirm it, you know that Matt has a logically valid point here. And you know as well as I do, Ken, that if you concede the logical possibility that Matt is telling the truth here, then the onus for this logical problem falls squarely on the shoulders of the God that you are desperately white knighting for.
I mean, you essentially admit this in your opening statement when you say you don't know what would change your mind.
Right, he's saying that he doesn't know what would change his mind. That is not equivalent to him saying that nothing would ever change his mind. The first statement is him acknowledging that his mind could be changed in the face of sufficient evidence. But the second is flatly asserting that regardless of any evidence presented at all, changing his mind is impossible. These two things are in no way the same, and I honestly don't know how you're justifying drawing that false equivalence. I mean, beyond just desperately lying your ass off.
How can any rational person not know that?
Because a rational person recognizes that they themselves are not omniscient, and as such recognizes the logical possibility that there may be information out there that they are not aware of that could convince them of something. Them saying that they are not currently aware what such information would be is not the same as them saying such information does not exist.
I mean, I do. The Bible flat out tells us in 1 Corinthians 15:14.
Yeah, I'm just going to cut you off there, Ken, because you citing the Bible as your justification for why you believe your God exists is just you begging the question. That you happen to believe these concepts for bad reasons is your problem, not Matt's.
You prove to me that the evidence for the resurrection doesn't hold up, and my own scriptures tell me that my faith is in vain.
There are likely hundreds of examples contained within the body of Matt's own work that show how the purported evidence for the resurrection doesn't hold up. Not to mention that biblical scholarship itself holds the resurrection to be a theological claim which requires faith to believe, as opposed to an historical claim which is supported by the actual available evidence. Even I can tell you that just because a book claims it to be true doesn't mean it's true. And just because the book makes the claim that a bunch of Iron Age cultists believed it happened doesn't mean it actually did. The existence of the claim is in no way evidence that the claim itself is true.
Are you telling me that you don't know if you'd believe even if you personally witnessed the resurrected Christ?
Well, one, that obviously is not something that Matt has been presented with as of yet. Two, even if such an event did occur, you'd still have to address exactly how Matt would be able to determine that the entity in front of him was in fact Jesus, and not something else just claiming to be what he would expect Jesus to be. And three, there are no existing eyewitness reports to the resurrection itself. And if you're citing from Corinthians, Ken, Paul provides no clarifying information regarding any witness accounts. No names, no dates, no locations, no individual details of any kind, which in the end means you don't have 500 identifiable people making a verifiable claim about one guy. You just have one guy making an unverifiable claim about 500 unidentifiable people. And this is just one of many reasons why the book itself is not sufficient evidence for the existence of a god. Just like you don't believe that the Vedas are sufficient evidence to believe that Indra and Agni exist.
I mean, that's basically admitting that you won't be convinced no matter what.
It's not. That's just the same false equivalence that you've been working with your entire response.
And that's much more a statement about you than it is about God.
Yeah, it says that Matt is more intellectually honest than your God concept is. Fortunately, your God doesn't actually exist, so it's not really something that we need to be concerned with. And while I've long since learned that when it comes to apologetics that the 9th commandment is really more of a conditional than it is a universal, you yourself, Ken, should probably be a little bit more concerned with that overriding compulsion you have to blatantly lie to protect your religion. And that brings us to our last video, which, for the record, doesn't actually have anything to do with theism or atheism, but I'm including it for two reasons. One, because I think it's seriously fucking cool. And two, it's probably gonna piss off the flat earthers, which, you know, is always a bonus. Now, for those of us who passed grade school, we recognize that phenomena we just witnessed as being the solar analemma, which is a figure 8 pattern the sun makes in the sky when its position is photographed from a fixed location at the same time every day for a year. The pattern is a result of two factors. One, the Earth's axial tilt, and two, the Earth's elliptical orbit around the sun. The analemma shows both the north-south and east-west variations in the sun's position, with the top of the figure corresponding to summer and the bottom to winter, which is exactly why the snow shows up at this point in the analemma. In short, this particular phenomenon would be rendered impossible if it were the case that the Earth was flat. And I wanted to show it here because it's a fantastic example of an experiment that any flat earther could easily do, yet still, for whatever ridiculous reason they come up with on any random day, they refuse to. Now, I know that given the level of scientific illiteracy, willful ignorance, and outright deception on display here can make bridging the divide seem outright impossible. But that's when we have to remember that it is in fact not us that these people are trying to deceive and manipulate, it's their audiences. The voices trying to vilify critical reasoning and sanctify willful ignorance may be loud, but just because a person screams a lie doesn't make it any less a lie. So I hold that it falls to us that such disserving individuals have their victim pools reduced through the dissemination of the evidence that shows exactly how such individuals are just exploiting the fear that they are sowing and the willful ignorance that they are preaching for their own personal gain. Because if people are not afforded access to the tools necessary to recognize the game, then how can they ever be expected to recognize that they are the ones being played? Thank you all for watching. I hope you enjoyed the video, and if you did, please like, share, and subscribe, and hit that bell for notifications. And be sure to leave a comment below. I love reading your responses, and those interactions help with the dreaded algorithm. Don't forget, November is National Alzheimer's Awareness Month. The link to where you can support these important efforts is down in the description. And if you like what you saw here and would like to support my efforts further, links to channel membership and to get yourself some official Bridge the Divide gear are down in the description. Once again, thank you all so much for your continued support, and as always, be safe, be excellent to each other, and together we can bridge the divide.